What's going on, everybody? Culturedog Sam Hatch back here with video number 4 in this LaserDisc audio series. And the last video we went into Dolby Digital, which was the first 5.1 surround sound format to hit home video in any shape or form. Just happened to be on LaserDisc because LaserDisc is awesome. And then before that, we did a little bit about Dolby Surround and Pro Logic decoding and talked about analog and digital tracks, etc. So yeah, I mean, it's pretty amazing for a format that a lot of people don't know much about and think about as this really kind of niche and or failed product, that it was so progressive in terms of pushing all these different sound formats and just, you know, how groundbreaking it is, how connected it is with, you know, still what we're watching today on UHDs and everything like that. All that ground was broken in the LaserDisc territory. And DTS was something a lot of people were waiting for. It's digital theater systems. Terry Beard had been running it. And this 5.1 surround format that they'd been pushing in theaters was really taking off, especially with Steven Spielberg's, you know, rubber stamp and his love for it, and how they implemented it with the rollout of Jurassic Park in cinemas. There was a big push to dominate the theatrical market, and within a few years they had, you know, about like 1/3 of all cinemas in the entire world. So I mentioned before there was a little bit of a, you know, a three-way race between SDDS, which was Sony's multi-channel surround format, and Dolby's Dolby Digital, or Dolby Stereo Digital as they called it theatrically, and DTS. And even though I keep saying 5.1, but it had the potential, which they use now, to have any number of channels up to 5.1. You know, you could have a mono channel or something to that effect. But in terms of LaserDiscs, it was, you know, 5.1 was the name of the game. So they didn't get into a lot of, you know, 4.0 releases or anything like that, like they do on DVD. But it was a pretty dynamic format, and it allowed for full bandwidth, stereo surround. So I mean, you had surround sound before, but not, you know, from low hertz, you know, 20 hertz to, you know, 20 kilohertz, nothing like that. It was just very bandwidth limited, and it was just for effects and things like that. But, you know, theoretically, what you could have now would be like an audiophile version of surround sound, like, you know, the same quality that you were getting from your front speakers, you could be getting from your rear speakers. And the implementation of that idea was a little wonky at times. Like, we'll discuss the surround sounds and their levels and things like that. That was behind a lot of the fervor behind this battle in theaters being brought into home theaters, because places like Widescreen Review magazine were championing DTS because of the compression ratio they were using on their codec for LaserDiscs. And Dolby Digital, yeah, I've heard anywhere between a 16:1 ratio to an 11:1 ratio, but basically everyone says it's more like a 12:1 ratio. Whereas DTS's Coherent Acoustics, which was the eventual codec they dropped in 1997, was a 3:1. So it's far less compressed, but then other people would say that it was far less efficient as well. So it was, you know, had some wasted space. It was still lossy either way. It's nothing like what we have now with, you know, DTS HD master audio and all these lossless options. But in terms of 1990s audio, DTS was pretty badass. So yeah, it was like 1500 kilobits per second was the goal. It ended up being more like 1235. I've also heard that they lowered the bit rate a little bit because of some of the side effects of listening to that coming across your speakers as static, and we'll talk about that in a little bit too. If you lowered the bit rate, you would also lower the decibels of that static noise, supposedly. But I'm getting ahead of myself. DTS was late to the game. As I mentioned before, Dolby Digital had hit the market in 1995 in terms of its software, and then Pioneer rolled out a bunch of players, and then, you know, all the receivers, integrated amps, and pre-pros and everything had hit the market shortly thereafter, and the ball was rolling. And reading the press at the time, there was always, DTS was just right around the corner. They were right behind and on their way, and they were going to have better, more audiophile quality surround sound tracks. And they did get some product out there, but they were focusing more on multi-channel CDs. That was the thing they had out there for a little bit, so you could get some cheesy jazz or something like that and listen to it in 5.1 surround sound. So it was a predecessor to DVD audio and a super audio CD and all that kind of stuff. And I've heard some of those. I've sent some demo tracks that they would give me on some things, and it was pretty cool sounding. But I never really got into it back in the day, probably because my surround sound speakers weren't that killer at the time. But anyway, so there was always this promise of them, catching up in 1995. In fact, when Jurassic Park, was released, it was originally released in Dolby Surround, and then eventually there was a 5.1 Dolby Digital release. But when it came out on DTS, originally it was going to come out as part of the Signature Collection series as a big DTS disc. And there was a big disagreement on how to implement 5.1 on LaserDisc between Dolby and DTS. Dolby ended up stealing one of the analog audio tracks, because here in the States, it wasn't like with PAL LaserDiscs in Europe. We had digital stereo tracks in the 90s and the original analog audio tracks that were there from the birth of LaserDisc. So you had multiple choices of things to do, and that led the way for commentary tracks. You could have a full stereo PCM Dolby surround track that could then be decoded into ProLogic surround, and then also have a commentary track or like a music and effects isolated track on the analogs, or and then just have like a mono analog track left over. So Dolby Digital decided, hey, let's just take the right channel from the analog channel, and nobody's going to miss it, and then we could just leave that left one for mono, even though, like I said in the last video, a lot of times that left channel still got stolen for commentary tracks, etc. And then you were left with no options if you had an older pre-digital age LaserDisc player. But DTS disagreed with that, and their stance was that analog tracks were great quality and were their way to create this legacy, maintain this backwards compatibility with older players. So there was a truth to their complaints, and they also truthfully stated that Dolby Digital required you to either retrofit and modify your current player to put in an AC3 RF output, or it was forcing you to go buy a new player. And it was true at the time. This doesn't really mean as much now because, like I said in the last video, there's piles of AC3 compatible players sitting for $20 in thrift stores right as we speak. But at the time, it seemed like this was a sticking point. Whereas DTS, all you needed was a digital out on your player, and those had been implemented since the 80s. So you could have a quality player from the 80s and be able to play a 5.1 surround sound track in 1997 through it. And all you needed to do was, say if you had a Toslink optical out, all you needed to do was have that optical cable just bam go right to your receiver. Game over, as long as your receiver was capable of decoding DTS Coherent Acoustics streams. So that was pretty cool. I mean, I certainly enjoyed the fact that my very first player, I bought a Sony MDP-333. I bought that in 1993, and then when I got Jurassic Park on DTS LaserDisc, this is my beater copy, but you can't have too many copies of Jurassic Park DTS. When I got this from Ken Cranes in 1997, I was able to play this through my Sony player that I had bought 4 years before this LaserDisc even dropped, and I bought it before Jurassic Park was even in theaters. So that was pretty cool. The backwards compatibility aspect is badass, and that's undeniable. It doesn't mean as much today as it did back in the day, but that was cool. Where DTS was wrong was in assuming that audiophiles or near audiophiles would be perfectly fine with giving up the PCM stereo tracks, the digital stereo tracks, and then would be left behind with analog tracks. And it created the situation, which was the situation to be avoided at all costs, was to have multiple inventory, secondary inventory. DTS LaserDisc became a niche within a niche. So by piggybacking Dolby Digital into the discs that I mentioned before, everybody was already buying that copy of True Lies you already bought before you even knew really about Dolby Digital and before you had any Dolby Digital gear. it was already there. So then later on, after you bought a new player, or if you bought a new receiver or demodulator or whatever, then you could go back and you wouldn't have to buy more discs. You could just revisit the ones you already had. Whereas digital audio was such a calling card. It was kind of such a killer app part of LaserDisc in the 90s. I think DTS kind of underestimated the public's demand for those kind of discs. And nobody was going to buy Jurassic Park and listen to analog audio until they got around to getting like a DTS capable player. It was cool if you happen to have a copy land in your lap and you had an older player. Yeah, sure, you could listen to the analog tracks and enjoy it, but it wasn't enough of a pull to get people to go buy these discs, and unless you were going to buy them as a specific DTS fan, or you wanted to listen to that specific soundtrack. The other drawback is that when you were listening, say, through those stereo jacks from the back of your player, if you had a digital age player, they start up and they start playing the digital tracks by default. So you can have a blast of static because all that noise is just going to come over your speakers. All that data where the DTS is stored within in the PCM tracks is going to come through your player. The player's not going to know what it is, and it's just going to come booming out of static. Hence why I mentioned before, why they lowered the bitrate a little bit. Supposedly that also lowered the decibels of that outpouring static. So when it hit your speakers, it wouldn't necessarily destroy them, but it wouldn't sound delightful either. So yeah, usually when you fire up a DTS disc on anything but a DTS system, if you had a receiver that had the decoder or whatever, it was fine. It just started up and you heard the Universal logo and everything was hunky-dory. But if you, I watched Long Kiss Goodnight at work one time for a Christmas party. And I had the DTS disc and it fires up and you just hear, and I'm like, crap. And you're like running for the remote to punch in the digital analog buttons to change over to the analog tracks. So yeah, that was a little bit of a drawback. But yes, around the time it was when Universal, obviously being tied in with DTS, they were pumping out 3 copies of everything, because not only did you have the regular Dolby Digital related product, you also had Signature Collection special editions, and then you had DTS editions on top of it. Sometimes they just had the special collectors, Signature Collectors Edition and DTS. Sometimes it was only 2 copies, but in any way, shape, or form, what happened was what nobody wanted to have happen, is that DTS discs were a specific thing, and you had to have double inventory. But yeah, so the surround sound within these discs stole the space that the PCM digital tracks would normally take up. And they were far less compressed than the Dolby Digital counterparts. So the magazines, like Widescreen Review, that for some reason never cared that this stuff was vaporware for 2 years. They still had a point that this was a little bit closer to audiophile standards. It did take a good 2 years though. January 97 is when DTS discs started rolling out. So a full 2 years after Dolby Digital. And I am going to eventually do the proper original series I was going to do about the LD audio inner workings, because it was pretty fascinating. Just the development of these technologies and the stuff going on behind the scenes, because LaserDisc was a kind of proving grounds for these technologies, a test, because people forget about how early DVD and HD TV were part of the electronics collective consciousness, the industry at the time. So Dolby Digital was gunning for standards adoptions. Like, they were gunning to become the standard for HD TV and the standard for DVD. And DTS were always late to the game in terms of that stuff. And so then that in turn would fuel more furor from the magazines. Like, why did these alliances adopt these low bit rate Dolby products when they could have total vaporware instead? And DTS was probably focused a little bit too much on conquering the theatrical world, and they failed to deliver on the home video format. Maybe they were doing too much R&D. They did kind of redesign things. Like for a while, it was called Zeta Digital, and then eventually Coherent Acoustics came out, which is a little bit different codec than what they had theatrically, and but it sounds fantastic. So the wait was worth it, and the only issue was that there were some levels matching, whereas theatrically, as a throwback to the old days when surrounds were mono, surrounds are usually attenuated down 3 decibels, so that when you have say 2 surround channels blaring behind you at the same time, together they'll be 3 decibels louder than one channel. So they're attenuated down 3 dB, so that the surrounds in total will be the same as your front right speaker, your front left speaker. So DTS conveniently forgot about that. So while Dolby Digital mixes were attenuated 3 dB in the surrounds for the first couple of years, DTS LaserDisc weren't. And then there was also the case of the LFE, low frequency effect track, the 0.1 of 5.1 on Jurassic Park being, some say, 10 decibels too hot. So these kind of differences, if you have a difference in volume, sometimes that'll make a listener think, oh, I'm hearing things that I'm not in the other mix. So it seemed far more dynamic and punchy than the Dolby Digital counterparts. But that said, Jurassic Park on DTS LaserDisc is dynamic and punchy as hell. It is a roof shredder. I mean, I put it on for the first time and I was like, Jeebus, crap. This is some serious stuff. One of the other draws that brings people to LaserDisc nowadays is that near field mixing wasn't as much of a industry trend back in the day, so you stand more of a chance of actually capturing a theatrical mix. Sometimes it's like the Alien 5.1 release on Dolby Digital is a 70mm 6-track, ported over. There's an old Dolby Surround Die Hard, that's a theatrical mix. But yeah, you could theoretically get, especially in terms of Dolby Digital, which was, the LaserDisc actually had more bit rate than the theatrical Dolby Digital. So you could just dump that Dolby Digital track right on over with no work or thought necessary. But yeah, a lot of times you were getting these dynamic theatrical mixes, and so they weren't taking into consideration that you were sitting a lot closer to your speakers in a smaller environment. Nowadays, everything's remixed and tweaked a little bit, and it drives some collectors crazy. Whereas, you have to kind of decide whether or not it's a good thing or not, because, if the dynamics are too loud in your space, you're not going to be able to hear your center channel properly, etc. But so supposedly near field mixing is a good thing. But then again, when you hear these theatrical mixes, sometimes they're pretty badass. And DTS discs, they sound fantastic. So one of the things I really appreciated about DTS hitting LaserDisc, it's more in terms of how I appreciate it now. I mentioned before they were fighting with Dolby for inclusion, or at least selection as a standard for HD TV and DVD. When they hit LaserDisc, that was the birth of DVD. We're talking 1997, so LaserDisc was theoretically on its way out at that point. So I thought it was really cool that there was something new and exciting to hit the market to make you want to go out and buy LaserDisc. And true, like in those last years, I picked up, DTS LaserDisc because, Ken Cranes would sometimes have them cheap. And when LD was on its way out, I could get, cool box sets and things from them. But yeah, I could also get DTS overstock. And I'm like, yeah, that's awesome. So yeah, on one hand, it was a way of making you rebuy the same stuff you bought over and over again. But Dolby Digital was doing that anyways. They were pumping out new copies of films that they'd already released in Dolby Surround, but now they were dropping them in 5.1. So DTS just gave you another option. And yeah, these roughly 1200 kilobit per second mixes were pretty intense and badass, and would give your system a real workout. So it was pretty impressive stuff. And nowadays, collectors love them for multiple reasons. Because, well, one, they're a little rarer. to find than Dolby Digital ones because they were released from 1997 and on out. And there were some released in Japan, etc. So it wasn't just here in the States. So some were a little bit tougher to find than others, and they're already starting to creep up in price. So there's this cachet, this kind of like cool collectability to them. And two, they sound great. They sound fantastic. And, people are always looking for theatrical mixes of things now. So the DTS mixes are just something really cool and great about them, and fun to fire up and just experience your house being torn to shreds. And it really is, a home theater format. When you're jaded today with all these, Atmos mixes and everything on there, it's easy to flash back to the primal potency of home theater when you're listening to these DTS mixes. You're like, oh yeah, this is what it was all about, like bringing that experience into your home, because they're just so dynamic and great sounding. So there's that. And then there's also a third element in that since these were pressed later, they weren't pressed at the same facilities as the earlier renditions. And a lot of times these were pressed at Kure, a Japanese plant that generally pressed very, very good product. So while a Dolby Digital release of something like Volcano might have been pumped out by a pressing plant that was prone to laser rot, the DTS version, which was pressed a little bit later, is perfectly fine. That's a great pressing. It's also interesting, sometimes THX certified discs, they didn't even bother to get them certified later, even though it's probably the same video master, etc. But THX wasn't involved in the process. More on THX in the next video. But yeah, so DTS, it was worth the wait. It was, both companies were right in their approach, which is kind of fascinating. And they were both wrong at the same time. So Dolby Digital is a little bit easier to collect, but it's tougher to play because of the demodulator aspect. So yeah, what do you need for DTS discs? I mentioned before, you just need a player with a digital out. And there were companies like MSB that added modifications. You could add like a toslink optical out or a digital out to your player. But there's a decent amount of players out there. So just look for a digital out. That's all you need. And that's the same thing you could use to pump out PCM digital stereo tracks too. So it's a great kind of double whammy. Once you connect that, you could listen to all those killer PCM tracks on tons of discs, in addition to being able to play these DTS tracks. And then you need just that single audio cable to connect to some sort of device, a preamp processor, integrated amplifier, a receiver, anything that can decode DTS. And that was, around 1999, they were starting to implement it in these devices. Before then, you'd have to buy an outboard decoder. For the longest time, I wanted to buy this Technics one that I saw at Circuit City all the time. It was the coolest thing possible. So there was standalone Dolby Digital processors, decoders, and there were also standalone DTS processor decoders, and they decode the 5.1 signal, and then they pump out 6 individual RCA jacks out of the back of it to connect via 6 cables to a receiver, and you could do it that way. But nowadays, DTS is pretty much included in just about all of our AV gear. And as long as you have a player that has a digital out and a receiver that has a compatible digital in, that's all you need. You're good to go. So it's pretty plug and play in those regards. So, and fairly well backwards compatible as well. And though there are some special editions that steal some of those analog tracks for commentary tracks, etc. I'm looking at you, GoldenEye. So it's not always 100% backwards compatible, but you'll still get, a mono analog channel if you're listening to these on something like GoldenEye on an older player. But so yeah, it's a great format. It's highly collectible. There's still a decent amount of titles out there, and it's one of those things people like to try and complete. They try and complete all the Criterion releases. They try and complete all the signature collections. They try and complete all the DTS discs. So yeah, it's got a draw to it. So if you're coming at LaserDisc now, you're going to have a lot of other competitors hunting for these things. But sometimes it's just fun to pick up ones as they come at you, which is kind of what I do. But anyways, that's the basics of DTS on LaserDisc. We're going to come back next with a mixture of things, just a wrap up. We're going to talk about THX. We're going to talk about cables, some troubleshooting ideas, etc. And yeah, wrap this series up. So cheers, everybody. I'll talk to you soon. Peace.